Hello, this is Pastor Josh, and this is The View from My Chair. Today we're going to go directly to the view into God's Word because we have a lot to cover in Hosea chapter 13, which is where we're focusing this week. Hosea chapter 13 begins with another declaration against Ephraim being a stand-in likely for the people of Israel. What we see here is the specific terminology is shifted. We now see guilt and the death of Ephraim framing Hosea's condemnation spoken against them. In verse 1, we see this guilt and death introduced, and then those themes show up at the very end of the chapter, guilt, and then in a very graphic depiction, they will fall by the sword, their children will be dashed to pieces, pregnant women ripped open. Instead of Ephraim, though, we see Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And those two verses, verse 1 and verse 16, frame this very strict declaration of judgment against the people. Verses 1 through 3 specify the particular theme of idolatry. One more time, we see the condemnation that's coming of guilt and death comes because of their idolatry. And then in verses 4 through 8, we see a biographical section spoken of God's biographical journey with the people of Israel. It's Yahweh's history with the people, and it is that history that sets apart why it is that he is coming in wrath. Their pride, they have forgotten me, become proud. This is why God will come to them like a lion. Instead of being a shepherd protecting them from the predators out in the wilderness, now God is the predator coming to attack them because of their rejection of him and violation of his covenant relationship. Verses 9 through 11 continue that expression, and in a very personal way, I will destroy you, and even their king will not be able to save them. There is no escape from God's judgment for them at this point. And verses 12 through the end of the chapter, 12 through 16, speak to the people's foolishness and Yahweh's wrath coming together to assure their coming disaster. This is one of the most strong places where there's strong language used against the people of Israel, and it is a sad statement altogether. In the midst of it, though, in verse 14, there is a really important reference that gets picked up in the New Testament. Hosea chapter 13, verse 14 is quoted in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 54 and 55. However, the translation of verse 14 is somewhat debated, especially around the opening verbs translated here, I will ransom and I will redeem. The question is, in Hebrew, the verbs used there are ambiguous and can either be a declaration, as is translated in the Christian Standard Bible, I will ransom, I will redeem, or it can be translated as a rhetorical question, which is represented in the New American Standard, shall I or will I redeem them from death? Will I ransom them from the power of Sheol? It's an important question because in the context, it seems that there is no expression of hopefulness throughout this particular chapter. And even in the verse in question, compassion is hidden from my eyes is the expression that ends this particular verse. It puts the I will ransom translation, I will redeem, seemingly out of place. And so most commentators indicate that the Hebrew likely should be translated as this question, shall I ransom them? Shall I redeem them? It is God asking in a rhetorical way, what should I do in light of Ephraim, Israel's rejection of me? The Net Bible uh, makes this explicit in their translation, not just by translating this as a rhetorical question, but by adding the answer, no, I will not. They add that answer right after those two questions. That expression is not in Hebrew. However, it is the way that they are trying to clearly interpret what seems to have been the original intention of Hosea as he wrote it. However, this seems to be a problem, especially when we think about how the Apostle Paul uses Hosea chapter 13, verse 14. Because Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 seems to take this as a note of hopefulness as he discusses what's going to happen to Christians who pass away in light of the resurrection of Jesus. He quotes first Isaiah, this is Isaiah 25, verse 8, and then aspects of Hosea 13:14. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? And seems to state this as a positive statement. That is, death has been overthrown in the resurrection of Jesus, and this fulfills the prophecy of Hosea. And so Christians can have hopefulness even in the face of death. But if the translation is as strong as the Net Bible puts it, with a strong rhetorical question with the answer, no, I will not, then it seems that Paul has, in the very least, misinterpreted Hosea chapter 13. So what's going on here? Are we to see this as, will I ransom, or shall I ransom, or I will ransom? I think a little bit of historical context is helpful here. I think that likely the New American Standard gets this right in terms of its initial translation, and it's probably reflective of the Hebrew text. This would be the Masoretic text in terms of its reference point. One of the reasons why many translations will refer to Hosea 13:14 as I will ransom is because the Greek Old Testament, or the Septuagint, LXX is the typical way to describe that, translates this in the same way that you see here. The Septuagint translates, I will, I will. The Septuagint is translated about 2 centuries before Christ's coming, well after the Hebrew text, and well after the people of Israel, the northern kingdom, have been taken into exile, but also returned from exile. So what I think is that the Septuagint translators, looking back on the question in Hebrew, as stated, shall I ransom, shall I redeem, and they realized that God did indeed ransom. God did indeed redeem a remnant of the people of Israel. And so from their perspective, the perspective of the Septuagint, after the exile and return, then God's rhetorical question now is clear. He will redeem. He will ransom. Compassion will not be hidden from his eyes forever, though from the perspective of Hosea and the people of Samaria, his compassion was hidden from his eyes. They would experience all the judgment warned about in the prophet Hosea. Paul, when he writes 1 Corinthians 15, writes from a similar perspective of the Septuagint, but also, not only is he post-exile, he is also post-resurrection. And so he has even more reason to see that the rhetorical question, will I ransom them, is actually answered affirmatively by God in the context of history. He will ransom. He will redeem. In fact, the resurrection of Jesus proves that this is the case. And so I think that's how we can handle this as we teach Hosea 13:14. We ought not be disturbed by how Paul uses this particular Old Testament reference. We just need to see it in its historical context. There is one other question that is raised by Paul's use of Hosea 13:14, and maybe you caught it if you're looking carefully at the two texts side by side. This has to do with the translation that we see here, O death, where is your victory? But when we look in the Hebrew text, we see the rendering is death, where are your barbs? There is a clear discrepancy here. Was Paul misquoting the Hebrew, or was he making something up there? Well, we don't know for sure, but most likely what was happening is that Paul was using another Greek translation of the Old Testament that is now represented by what we would see today in the Syriac translation. The reason why we say that is in the Syriac translation of the Old Testament, victory is the way that Hosea 13:14 is translated. The Syriac would agree with Paul. Why would Paul use victory in that particular context? And then how does it relate to death is swallowed up in victory? Well, in Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8, which is where this particular reference comes from, we see, again, another what seemingly discrepancy. In Isaiah 25, verse 8, it says, when he has swallowed up death once and for all, not in victory. But again, when we look at one of the other Greek Old Testament translations, this one represented by Theodotion, we see that Theodotion uses victory. Excuse me. So it would seem that the Greek Old Testament that Paul was looking at was represented by the translations in the Syriac and the Theodotion, which did use victory. And so Paul saw the connection between Isaiah 25, verse 8, and Hosea chapter 13, verse 14, both of which in his translations of the Old Testament used the word victory, and saw their connection, placed them together to show that in both of these Old Testament contexts, we see a foretelling, a prediction of a time in which death is wiped away and tears are removed from every face, and the people's disgrace is also removed because the Lord has spoken, all related from Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8. So when Paul writes that there is a coming time when the perishable puts on the imperishable and the mortal puts on immortality, when death is swallowed up in victory, and when death has no longer any sting, he's doing so from the perspective of the resurrection as he looks back on the Old Testament. This gives us great confidence as we remember in our own time that there are difficult circumstances, and sometimes it seems that even God's people are failing. But as we look through the course of history, we see that God's plan always wins, and that the resurrection of Jesus guarantees that his plan will continue, and we, his people, we will remain secure in him. And so we have great hope as we look forward to the time when our own mortality is swallowed up with immortality, and we see that death truly is not the victor, that Christ in his resurrection is the victor over all. May God bless you as you continue to explore his word.